Hi and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'd like to share with you my experience with HDR photography and how smartphone cameras compare to real cameras such as the mirrorless Canon R5. It's no secret that smartphones such as the iPhone and Samsung Galaxy produce really nice looking imagery despite the tiny lens and imaging sensors. This is because of computational photography. One of the most used computational processes is for producing HDR or high dynamic range photography. The new iPhone 16 Pro Max, along with many other smartphones, by default records HDR photography and can also produce HDR video in certain formats. Smartphone cameras basically have to run a load of computational algorithms to compensate for the lack of overall quality due to the extremely small imaging sensors. I have personally shot some really nice photographic content using my iPhones over the years. However, I've never really considered using them for serious or professional work. I always prefer to use my cameras to do the job properly. But did you know that for quite a while, real cameras actually have high dynamic range features built in, and with full frame or even APS-C size image sensors, along with a huge range of outstanding lenses from the older DSLR lenses to third-party lenses or the new mirrorless range, the HDR imagery on a real camera is going to be significantly better quality than that of any smartphone, including the very latest models. I think because all major smartphones utilize computational processes, so the photos generally always look fairly decent, to the point where the average person would think, why would I need a real camera? I have my smartphone. Also, bearing in mind that with real cameras we can shoot in RAW format in order to make the most of the dynamic range and colour information recorded by the image sensor. This obviously requires a certain process, which does take a lot more time. Generally, the average person wants to post their content straight from the phone to their socials without the need of any editing or processing. This is why so many people prefer smartphone imagery over real cameras, as the JPEG files straight out of camera aren't running these HDR or computational processes and therefore tend to look inferior to smartphones, despite being created using larger imaging sensors with better quality optics. And it's most certainly why there has been a huge decline in the sale of compact and DSLR cameras in recent years. Most often, images straight out of the camera without the use of good light probably wouldn't look anywhere as good as the smartphone, as by default they do not implement any of these HDR processes. But you can simply turn these features on within your camera's menu system if you prefer to shoot in HDR and don't have any desire to edit in RAW. Let's take a look at some examples taken with the Canon R5 and the iPhone 16 Pro Max. This was taken with the HDR features in the Canon R5. As you can see, the HDR icon is visible on the screen. I'll go through some of the features later in this video, but they are far more comprehensive than compared to the iPhone. This is an image of the same scene straight out of camera. No HDR, no RAW editing or any other processing, just the JPEG file. As you can see, the image looks kind of dull. It really lacks any sort of detail in the shadows and hardly any colour and contrast in the sky. This is an image created on the iPhone 16 Pro Max with the wide 13mm lens. Not quite exactly the same position, but roughly the same time of day. This is with all the HDR processes running by default. Basically, I have no control over any of these HDR settings. The phone just does it all for me, which is fine as it's done a fairly good job. But it really does lack any detail than compared to the camera. This image was taken with the main camera on the iPhone, which uses the larger sensor. It's generally a nice looking image, has some really good detail in areas, it's bright, noise levels are controlled, but overall there is a distinct lack of detail and sharpness than compared to the images from the camera. But it's definitely a better looking image and far more appealing than the JPEG straight out of camera. However, the HDR images from the Canon camera in comparison has done a better job, even though the colours do look quite exaggerated and oversaturated, but I can fix that later in Lightroom. Now I'm just going to show a few other HDR photos, one taken with a Canon but zoomed in slightly at 28mm and the iPhone using the 13mm ultra wide lens. These are both roughly from the same position. The point I'm making here is the lens on the R5 camera has a constant aperture, so I'm able to zoom in and out but also maintain the aperture I've set the camera to. This is a huge advantage when trying to record the maximum amount of detail in your scene. But when I compare the two images, the iPhone does appear to be more pleasing, a little bit sharper and a lot brighter. That is until I zoom in, where the photo from the camera reveals more detail and a much wider range of colours. The easiest way to compare is to take all the images into Lightroom. Now, before I go into more detail about the image quality, I'll show you quickly how to set up the HDR features on the Canon cameras. There are very similar settings found on the Sony and Nikon cameras, as well as the Lumix, OM and Fuji cameras. All mirrorless cameras basically share the same features. They just have slightly different terminology. On the Canon menu in the red section, scroll across to the fifth bank and then scroll down to the HDR mode. By default, it will be set to disable HDR. Just scroll down to switch this to off. Then you'll have the option to set the dynamic range to either auto, +1 EV, +2 EV, or +3 EV. So basically the camera is shooting 3 consecutive images at different exposures and then blending them together to create the HDR image. The higher the exposure value, which is EV, the wider the dynamic range. If you go back one level in the menu system, scroll down to effect, this will control the overall look of the final JPEG, similar to that of a picture style for standard JPEG files. The best thing to do here is just experiment with different effects. You can set the camera to continuous HDR every shot. This means the camera will stay in HDR mode until it's disabled, or simply select one shot only and the camera will disable the HDR mode after the shot has been taken. If shooting HDR handheld, there may be some small camera shake, as the camera will be recording 3 separate images and blending them together. Setting auto image align to enabled will help to align all the images. The final option in the menu is to save source image to either all of the images that the camera has taken, or to simply be left with the final HDR image. So that's the HDR menu on the Canon R5. Other cameras will have something fairly similar, but generally it all works the same. Just to clarify, this image was shot using auto dynamic range and using the Art Vivid effect. And this shot was taken using +3 EV and the natural image effect. So this image is basically using a wider dynamic range and it's using a more natural image tone. I'd like to show you all the HDR features on the iPhone, but it's all on by default, so there are no actual settings unless you buy a third-party app. Now let's take a look at all the images in Lightroom. Okay, so here we are inside Lightroom and I have the images loaded in. So I have the 2 images from the Canon R5, the 2 HDR images that we're going to look at. These are obviously both shot using slightly different HDR settings that I just kind of covered in the menu system. And I've loaded in 4 images from the iPhone. Now the reason I've done that is because you're able to use different camera systems in the iPhone. So you have the 13mm wide camera, which is this one here, which is generally slightly poorer quality because it's using a smaller sensor. Then you've got the main camera, which is giving you roughly around sort of 24mm full frame equivalent field of view. So it's not as wide, but the sensor is much larger and you're going to get a much better quality image. We've got various different versions here. So let's take a look at the 2 HDR images from the Canon cameras, and they've both been taken at different HDR settings within the menu system. So we're going to select both of these and go to develop. The first thing I'm going to say is it's just the scene is highly exaggerated. The colors are not very accurate. This image has a extreme kind of purple tint to it, which is not very reflective of the scene. The iPhone images are actually far more accurate to how the scene actually was. But because of the various HDR settings in the menu, it's given me this kind of very, very deeply saturated image, which I'm going to adjust now. I'm just going to hit on auto, see what that does. It doesn't really do much. So I'm just going to change the white balance a little bit. Going to bring the colors down. Going to push the tint more towards the green. And yeah, that's way more accurate to how the scene was in real life, I have to say. Still got this kind of purple tint to the clouds, which we could probably fix later on. But generally, that's looking much better now. But I can come down to the color mixer and I can control some of these hues here, which are really useful. So it's going to work on that for a little bit. Generally, that's looking much better. Let's just go down to calibration, change some of these. So just done a quick edit on this image and it's looking far more kind of realistic, I think. So just going to apply a similar sort of thing to the other image. So this image was kind of zoomed in at 28 millimeters. So again, I'm just going to hit auto and see what it does. It's kind of brightened the image up a little bit. Let's just crop it in. Let's just straighten up the horizontals. It's going to start to work into the image a little bit. Again, this image has that kind of purple tint, purple haze to it, which is really exaggerated, and kind of want to adjust that. So just by bringing the tint down from magenta towards the green, and that's pretty much done the job, and that's way more accurate to how the scene was in real life. Obviously bear in mind that we are working with the JPEG file. This is not a RAW file, so we are kind of limited to the amount of edits that we can do. We don't want to push it too much, but generally that's pretty good. I'm quite happy with that, I have to say. Okay, so we're going to leave those edits there. Really quick, simple edits, just to alter the colors a little bit to make the colors a little bit more accurate to how they were in real life. Then we have a look at the iPhone again. I'm just going to straighten the image up a little bit. Just to we're going to lose a few pixels, but just going to straighten that up. My immediate reaction when I'm comparing this to the R5 camera, the colors look a little bit dull. They're not quite as vivid. The image is quite sharp. I mean, the water is nice and sharp, whereas we're obviously using a longer exposure for the Canon, so the water is kind of blurred out a little bit because of slower shutter speed. There's a lot of really nice detail in the foreground here, but if I were to say, let's click on these two here and let's do a sort of side-by-side comparison. Let's try and get them at roughly the same. Okay, so we've got the images roughly the same size on the screen, and I've got to be honest, the iPhone image hasn't done a bad job. I mean, it's actually pretty good. Just going to zoom it out a little bit. Yeah, it's pretty good, but you can see on the Canon there's just way more detail in the foreground. Overall, there's just a greater depth of colour. The colours are way more vivid. The scene isn't really that much sharper, I've got to be honest, but there's a lot more colour detail in the background, I think. But the iPhone image, I mean, it's not bad. The real camera, I think, does have a lot more depth to it, and the colours are way more vivid. But generally, they're both pretty good. But now, if I were to compare this image taken on the Canon R5 to that of the super wide 13mm on the iPhone, this is when things get really interesting, because that 13mm wide image on the iPhone is absolutely terrible in comparison to a real camera. And this is where the iPhone really starts to fall apart. Unfortunately, yeah, the iPhone image was taken at a different position, so it's not a good comparison because of the fact that it's not in the same position, but you can clearly see the level of detail in the iPhone image is really lacking. There's not a lot of noise, so when these images are being taken, so these are HDR images, so it's taking a set of exposures and blending those images together, but it's also running a whole set of other computational processes. So it's running probably noise control. So it's eliminating a lot of noise that's in the image, but by doing so, it's really taken out a lot of detail. There's almost like zero detail in the background, and there's a little bit of detail in the foreground. So compared to the real camera, it's picked up so much detail, foreground, middle ground, and background. iPhone image really is lacking so much detail. Okay, so there's a slightly better comparison between these two images here, because they're pretty much taken at the same spot. So the image on the left, taken by the Canon R5, slightly zoomed in at 28mm, and the one on the right, I've basically zoomed in slightly as well, using the wider camera. So yeah, so if I zoom in, trying to get them at the same kind of level here, just to make it fair. So we zoom in on this kind of piece of wood here. You can see on the left on the Canon so much detail that's picked up. Really incredible amount of detail, especially across all these kind of wooden kind of planks on this jetty. Yeah, really nice and crisp and sharp. The iPhone on the right, yeah, again, it's probably running some kind of noise control just to bring those noise levels down, and because of that, it's kind of blurred out the image as well. Or it could just be the fact that the sensor isn't capable of recording that level of detail. It's one of those two. But there's not a lot of noise in the iPhone image, and this is quite a low light scene. So I think there's some sort of computational noise control being applied to this image, which you don't really have a lot of control over. You literally have no control over those settings. In the Canon, yeah, noise is really well controlled, and there's just so much detail all over the image. So yeah, both done a really good job, but for me, the HDR imagery coming out the Canon is really quite good. So I'm going to take this image here, and I'm just going to run a few edits again. I'm just going to straighten the image up a little bit. That looks a bit better. We're losing a few pixels, obviously, every time we do a crop. Let's just bring it down a little bit. Let's just hit auto here, and yeah, I mean, it looks all right. I mean, it looks pretty good when I just do a really basic kind of Lightroom edit. Actually looks quite nice. Going to zoom in a little bit just to show you the level of detail. But yeah, you really don't get a lot of dynamic range. So when I try and adjust the highlights, just to bring the sky down a little bit, yeah, it's push the blacks. I mean, the blacks have basically already clipped. So the image straight out of the phone or straight out the camera on the iPhone, if I set the blacks to 0, the blacks have already clipped basically. So that's not a good start. Let's just go to develop settings, and it's just a reset. Yeah, so you can see straight out of camera, the highlights in the sky have been clipped, and the blacks in the kind of shadow dark areas have also been clipped. So I haven't done any edits at all, and that is basically what I have. So very difficult to work with, whereas in the Canon, straight out of camera, let's go to develop settings and just reset. Yeah, there's a little bit of clipping in the blacks already, which can be adjusted, and the highlights, yeah, you can go all the way. This is a JPEG file, bearing in mind. So even with the JPEG, you're getting far more depth of color, and you're getting way more dynamic range. So let's just hit auto, and let's just take it from there. So I've eliminated all the blacks pretty much. A little bit in the foreground, it's not going to worry me too much. And there's no whites that are being clipped at all. So no blacks or whites are being clipped. Basically just adjusting the colors now, and just making the colors more accurate to how the scene was originally. So let's put that crop back in. So when it comes to dynamic range, imagery coming out the iPhone is very difficult to work with. So this is the main camera, which has the larger sensor, probably getting far better quality. Let's just hit auto here. Let's just try and control the levels of the blacks and the whites. So the highlights are clipping way sooner than the imagery coming out of the Canon, and also the blacks, but you're getting a lot more dynamic range. But of course, you want to make use of that super wide 13mm field of view. Unfortunately, you're getting really, really low quality imagery. Looks good on the screen, looks fantastic on your iPhone screen, and maybe even a computer screen. But when you want to start editing, unfortunately, you don't really have a lot of information to work with. So to conclude, iPhone HDR is actually fairly good when using the main camera, which has a 24mm full frame equivalent field of view. But there is an extreme lack of dynamic range compared to the HDR image from the Canon R5. Real cameras also provide significantly more options for settings for HDR imagery, and will record far more detailed and accurate imagery due to the significant array of high quality lenses. The wide angle lens, the 30mm lens on the iPhone 16 Pro Max, is, for me, not really capable of producing professional photographic results compared to a real camera. Sometimes it can be, it can be quite heavy, carrying all these, extra additional things you need, like tripods and so on, and tripod heads and various other attachments. It's really worth it at the end of the day, because the quality you're getting from a real camera compared to the iPhone, even though like smartphone imagery, it kind of looks really good on the screen, and you look at it and it's so easy just to post it straight from your phone to your social media accounts and stuff like that. But end of the day, the quality from a real camera is far, far better than that of any smartphone. So make the effort, take the extra gear, and enjoy your photography. Thanks for watching. I hope this video has been of some use somehow, and please give it a like, give it a share, and subscribe for more videos.